How's everyone doing tonight? You're doing great? All right, so we're continuing our book study theme, but there has been a miscommunication from my side. أنا one time كده لقيت مارينا فأنا قلت لها إيه يعني you're gonna give a talk يا مارينا فكده يعني out of my rush استر ولا روث جت في مخي كده استر مش عارف ازاي يعني المفروض روث يعني so it's I know sequentially we should be doing Ruth right now بس I told Marina استر وبعدين the night before قلت لها ايه رايك تعمل لنا روث no since you started Esther so we're gonna go with the book of Esther so thank you Marina and thank you everyone. I hope that all of us enjoy, so let's give a round of applause and encouragement. In the name of the Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit, one God, amen.
Okay, welcome everybody to today's meeting. So I wanted to start off by saying, first of all, I was very happy that Abuna accidentally told me Esther because I personally love the story of Esther. I know that sometimes we look at the Old Testament and sometimes we might feel like it's a little bit harder to read or to relate to than the New Testament. Like sometimes we find that the New Testament is maybe more relevant or maybe the Old Testament, it's hard to understand how this relates to us today. But I think when we really look at the Old Testament, all throughout, we can really see how a lot of the characters and a lot of the stories in the Old Testament allow us to both see how God reveals himself to his people, and we can see some of those characteristics of God, but also we look at a lot of the characters in the Old Testament and we can really see how, we can often relate to their shortcomings, but also learn from their strengths. So the story of Esther is no exception to that. A lot to learn from this story. I personally find it a very encouraging story. We'll get started. So a fun fact I want to talk about when we talk about Esther. Has anybody ever heard the story of Esther being referred to as the invisible hand of God? Has anyone ever heard that term before? Yeah? Okay, so fun fact, I don't know if you guys know this, but the story of Esther is the only book in the Bible where the word God is not mentioned. So this is something I've heard before, and I actually, double-checked that Control-F'd it on my computer just to make sure, and it's true. The word God is not mentioned throughout the whole story. And that's really interesting because if you think about it, if God is not mentioned, does that mean God is not present? Is his, seemingly his silence, does that mean it's his absence? But that's far from the truth. And as we go through the story today, we'll see how, at times where it seemed like God wasn't maybe doing much at that moment, where it seemed like the situation didn't look so good, really he was behind the scenes orchestrating and working on behalf of his people. And we'll kind of go through that today. And, as I mentioned, it is very relatable to us, and we'll talk about that a little bit more towards the end. So to start off with, I did want to give some background or historical context to the book of Esther. So it is set in the Old Testament. It's one of the only two books that are named after a female, the other one being Ruth. So it's set during the time of the Persian Empire's reign. So during this time, the Jews were originally under the Babylonian exile. Then after that came a period of time where some returned to Israel, but a lot of them were still under captivity under the Persian rule. So during this time, the king that was reigning was King Ahasuerus, who ruled from 486 to 465 BC. So he was a very powerful king. His kingdom spread over 127 provinces. So, he had from Ethiopia to India. And his kingdom was doing well at the time. It was thriving. And he was at the time married to Queen Vashti, who we'll see later on is a relevant character in the story. So the story takes place 100 years after the Babylonian exile, and it takes place in Persia, which is modern-day Iran today, the Susa, Persia, which is where the story takes place. The author of the story is actually unknown, so different sources cite different people for being the author. So according to St. Augustine, it was written by Ezra, but according to St. Clement of Alexandria, it was written by Mordecai, who is one of the main characters in the story. And just something to mention, the story is 10 chapters. However, there are additional chapters on the Deuterocanonical books. And it doesn't really change the context or any of the details of the story, just adds some background and, one of the chapters talks about a vision Mordecai had or just other details that are not in the 10 chapters. So I do encourage you to check them out if you can. Okay, so we'll start off with introducing the main characters of the story. So there are 4 main characters. So easy to follow in the sense that it's really 4 main people that we need to know in the story. However, the story is filled with a lot of plot twists, unexpected turn of events, and lots of circumstances that you really wouldn't see coming as, from the human perspective. So 4 main characters. So the first character is Esther, of course. Her name means star, and she is the star of the book of Esther. So she was an orphan who grew up with no parents, and she was a Jew. And she grew up raised by Mordecai, who was her cousin. So they were both Jewish and the people of God. King Ahasuerus, who we mentioned, who was reigning at the time, very powerful king, very wealthy. And then Haman, who's the antagonist of the story, or the bad guy in the story. And we'll kind of get to know the characters a little bit more as we go through the story. So I do want to start off by giving some background or a little bit of context to what happened in the story, briefly kind of going over the main events in each chapter. I know a lot of you already know the story, so a lot of us are already familiar with how the story, all the details in the story. But as we go through it, I encourage you to look at the story from 2 different perspectives. One, try to see in the story how, if you were part of the story, if you were one of the characters, how would you feel that maybe God is silent or God is not doing something? So try to see, we know how it ends and we know that God was present all throughout, but look at that story from the perspective of, if I was there at the time, what would my perspective be? And the second perspective, I also encourage you to look at the story from the perspective of Mordecai. And we'll touch upon why that's important. So those 2 perspectives as we go through it. So chapters 1 and 2, so this was a time where, as we mentioned, King of Persia, he's ruling, very powerful king. Kingdom is great, and he starts off by having a huge feast. So this feast is lasting 180 days, which is 6 months. So very long feast. And of course, after 6 months of partying, drinking, celebrating, he ends it off with a 7-day after party. So he's still celebrating 6 months after the original celebrations. So the purpose here, he's showing off his wealth, his power. He invites all his rich, powerful friends, and they're all celebrating in the kingdom. And to end off this season of celebration, he wants to parade his queen, Queen Vashti. So he asks for Queen Vashti to come out to parade her, and she refuses. So of course, now the king is enraged. He's embarrassing him in front of all his rich, powerful friends. She's not coming out. And he decides that he's going to dethrone her. So Queen Vashti is no longer the queen, and now the seat of the queen is empty. So to fill the seat, a beauty pageant is held to find the new queen. Now Mordecai, encourages or tells Esther to go and participate in this pageant. And to no surprise, as we know how the story goes, Esther isn't selected. She's as the new queen. So the king is smitten by her. She wins the favor of the king, and she's the new queen. Now chapter 2 ends off with an event which we'll later see on why this event is significant, but basically Mordecai, who's now sitting outside the palace, so Esther's now the queen, she's inside the palace, she's sitting with the king. Mordecai's still outside the palace. He overhears that two of the royal officials two of the royal guards are plotting to murder the king. So of course, being the good guy that he is, decides to do the right thing, tell Queen Esther so she can warn the king. So she does, to save the king's life, and the king documents this in the royal chronicles of the kingdom. So chapter 3 and 4, and we are introduced to Haman, who is the bad guy in the story. And unfortunately, this bad guy has a lot of power. He's the right-hand man of the king. So he's elevated to a high position in the kingdom. He's given a lot of power. So with his power, what does he do? He demands that everybody bows to him. So, of course, Mordecai refuses to bow down to someone who's other than God. It doesn't say the word God because the book doesn't mention God, but he refuses to bow down to Haman. So Haman is, of course, enraged when he finds out that Mordecai is Jewish. So he wants to destroy not just Haman, but all the people. He's extremely upset and wants to get rid of these people who are not following, what he has asked them to do. They cast lots to pick the day of when they will destroy and get rid of all the Jews, and they decide that this date is 11 months, and it's going to be in 11 months. So at this point, Mordecai and Esther, Mordecai, of course, is enraged, or he's very, very upset, and very, it talks about how he's outside in sackcloth, mourning, grieving, and he sends a message to Queen Esther to do something about this. So after a period of fasting, Queen Esther comes up with a plan that she's going to reveal her identity to the king. So at this point, the king doesn't know that she's Jewish. So she's going to reveal her identity and ask the king to reverse this decree to destroy and to get rid of all the Jews. Chapter 5 and 6. So after this period of waiting and this period of fasting, Queen Esther decides, okay, I'm going to invite the king and Haman, to both of them, to a royal banquet, and I'm going to tell them that I have a request to make. So she invites them to this royal banquet, and the king is, very happy with his queen, and he says to her, anything you want shall be yours, up to half my kingdom. So she says, okay, let's, tomorrow, let's come back and have another banquet, and I will tell you what I want from you at this time. So the next day, before the next day, so Haman goes home, and the king is going to sleep. On Haman's way home, he leaves the banquet, and again, he runs into Mordecai, who refuses to bow down to him. So at this point, Haman is even more enraged. This keeps happening, that Mordecai is refusing to follow this order. So Haman decides that I need to not only get rid of these Jews in 11 months, I need to do something about Mordecai today. So sooner than the 11 months. So he decides that he's going to have a plan where he's going to build 2 tall gallows, or 2 tall poles, to kill Mordecai and to get rid of him. That same night, the king has gone to sleep, but he can't sleep that night. So he, when people can't sleep, they usually go to a bedtime story or something to help them sleep. So he decides to ask someone to read him the Chronicles.
Facebook.
Yeah, they didn't have anything to scroll on, no TikTok, no nothing.
Instagram.
So they had to go to books. Like, who goes to books these days?
Who does this?
Just Twitter.
Maybe we should.
Maybe we should. It does work out, so maybe that's the sign. So the king has the royal chronicles read to him, and remember what we mentioned in chapter 2? What he wrote in the royal chronicles at the time, he wrote about Mordecai who saved his life. So at this point, he comes across the story, and he's like, oh wow, this man saved my life. What did I do to honor him, And he realizes that nothing was done to honor him, nothing was done to thank him. So he puts it in his head, okay, I should probably do something to honor this man who saved my life. So he takes Haman's opinion, and he says, hey, if you wanted to honor someone and really show them honor and glory, what do you think I should do? So of course, Haman, being who he is, very full of pride and very self-centered, assumes what? He assumes it's about him. He assumes that the king wants to honor him. So of course, he's going to go above and beyond and come up with the most elaborate plan. So he says, if you want to honor someone, give him your robe, give him your horse, parade him in front of all the people, show him glory. And the king's like, that's a great idea. That's exactly what I'm going to do for Mordecai. So imagine Haman's role at this, or his position at this time. He's probably shocked. Not only is it not for him, but it's for the person he hates the most. So that's how it kind of ends in chapter 6. Going on to the next chapters. So at this point, remember we said Queen Esther met with them for the first banquet, and she said, I'll let you know my request tomorrow. So the day of the second banquet comes, and Esther informs the king that she's Jewish, and that Haman, the man that's his right-hand man with all this power, is the one who plans to kill all the Jews and to kill her people. So the king orders that Haman to be killed on the same gallows that he made to kill who? To kill Mordecai. So unexpected turn of events as we saw the story is filled with that. At this point, Esther and Mordecai then plan to reverse the decree to kill the Jews. So at this time, if a decree came out with the king, you can't just get rid of it and say, never mind, the king changed his mind. It has to be something to change this. It's not easy to change a decree that came out with the king. So in this case, rather than reversing the decree, they end up coming up with a new decree to override the previous one. So since it can't be revoked, the counter decree is that the Jews can defend themselves against anyone who tries to kill them. And finally, the decree day comes, and the Jews, of course, triumph over their enemies. They destroy all those who plotted against them, and they establish the Feast of Purim, which is celebrated today by the Jews. And Mordecai is elevated second in command, and the Jews thrive. So that's a brief summary of the story. Of course, going through the chapters, a lot of great context and a lot more details that I left out just for the sake of time. But as we go through the story, I wanted to focus on 5 main themes that we see here. So the first theme that we see is the theme of obedience. And we see it here through two different characters in this story. Of course, we see it through Esther, who, throughout the story was very obedient to the person who raised her. Even when she's in a position of power, in a position of authority, at this point, she's no longer, she was raised by Mordecai's little girl as an orphan girl. She's no longer in that position. She's now the queen, but she still shows that humility and that obedience and continues to obey the commands of Mordecai, as referenced in Esther 2:20. But also, we see Mordecai's obedience to God. Esther 3:2 reads, "And all the king's servants that were in the king's gate bowed and reverenced him in, for the king had so commanded concerning him. But Mordecai bowed not, nor did him reverence." So, from Mordecai's perspective, the situation didn't look good. It looked like not only were the Jews in trouble, but also he specifically was in trouble. So he was refusing to bow down to someone who had a lot of power, who has the authority to destroy them. But Mordecai's main concern here was not, how do I strategically get out of this bad situation? How do I, maybe he could have been a little bit calculated and thought to himself, anytime I see him, I'll just avoid him, then I won't trigger him, I won't upset him, and I won't have to be in this mess. Or maybe he could have thought, I'll just bow down, which, of course was not something that he even considered, as we can see. But Mordecai was way more concerned with doing right in the sight of God. He wasn't concerned with how is God going to deliver us from, we're in captivity, the Jews are in a bad season. Him specifically, he's in a very bad position. He wasn't concerned with how will God show me his plan for me, or when, or why am I in this position, God? Why I'm refusing to bow down to someone who is against you? Why are you putting me in this position that's going to lead to my destruction? He wasn't concerned with any of the hows, the whats, the whens, any of that. He was really concerned with what ought I to do, and that's right in the sight of God. And he continued to show that obedience to God. So I think, as I mentioned in the beginning, the Old Testament is really relatable to us because sometimes we could feel like, okay, if I'm in a bad situation, I can sit here and try to analyze and calculate and orchestrate and think, how do I deal with this situation the best I know how? And that can sometimes feel very overwhelming. A lot of us sometimes say, what is God's will? Or when is God's will going to show? Or why is this God's will? But rather than focusing on all of this, one way to know for sure that you're in God's will is if you show continuous obedience to God. If you're more concerned with what can I do today that's aligned with doing right in the sight of God, rather than how do I figure out how this whole scenario is gonna play out. And we see Mordecai being such a great example of that. The next theme that we see here is the theme of trusting in God's sovereignty. So as I mentioned before, Mordecai is a character that it's great to look at the story from the perspective of Mordecai. We see here the concept of him trusting in God's sovereignty. So as mentioned, not only was the situation bad for the Jews, it was really bad for him specifically. So of course, when the decree came out, as any human would be, Mordecai was very distressed. It reads here, when Mordecai learned of all that had been done, he tore his clothes, put on sackcloth and ashes, and went out into the city, wailing loudly and bitterly. But he went only as far as the king's gate, because no one clothed in sackcloth was allowed to enter it. Found in Esther 4:1-2. So he reacted. Of course, this wasn't easy for him. It's not like, sometimes we think in the Old Testament the characters had a lot of faith or they trusted in God, and that must have been maybe easy for them, but today it's so much harder. No, he reacted the same way any of us would react. It's not, it's not easy to right away recognize that God is in control. Our first human reaction might be to see the situation from a human perspective. But just a few verses later, we see such a powerful statement, and arguably one of the most powerful statements in the book and in the chapter. He says to Esther, so we know at this point, after he found out what's going to happen, Esther was informed, and he says to Esther, "For if you remain completely silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place. But you and your father's house will perish. Yet who knows whether you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this." You see the confidence in the statement there? Like, he says to her, whether you help us or not, deliverance will come. He doesn't say, maybe deliverance will come, we hope deliverance will come. He's so sure in God's deliverance. And it's almost like, how could he be so sure and so confident in God's sovereignty at a time like this? From his perspective, he was always doing the right thing. He raised Esther, and he clearly did a very good job raising her, from how she is as the queen. We see that he's built in her the integrity and the humility and the compassion for her people. So he raised her. He was always, supporting her, rooting for her to audition for the queen, and always advising the king if there's harm coming to him, always doing the right thing. But yet he's found where? He's found outside the palace. The first verse there says he wasn't even allowed to enter the palace. So it's almost human nature. Maybe he could have felt like he was forgotten. Maybe he could have felt like he's doing the right thing all along, and he's not only not getting rewarded for it, like the king totally at this point didn't acknowledge that he saved his life, but also his situation keeps getting worse and worse.
Question?
But yes.
No, I thought I just made a realization where in that verse it even sounds like he has like compassion, that he's worried about her perishing. Like, so there's even the part where he's saying like it's like for you too, like deliverance will come, like you might as well be part of the solution. Like it didn't sound like he was like forcing her to do it, but it's more out of like concern for like the person he raised as well. So it's the first time I've seen him.
That shows another one of his traits of always doing the right thing. So just focusing on the character of Mordecai as we've done kind of in the last couple of slides. Not only is Mordecai such an underrated character in the story that I think doesn't get enough attention, but also Mordecai actually symbolizes Christ in the story, and Haman symbolizes the devil. So think about it, and we'll look kind of what the church fathers have to say about this. You don't take my word for it, but Haman does symbolize Christ in that, or sorry, not Haman symbolizes Christ, Mordecai symbolizes Christ, and in that he was supposed to die, but instead he ends up sitting at the right hand, or he sits next to the king. Can someone actually read this verse, this quote from the church fathers for me, please? Yes.
Mordecai also was persecuted as Jesus was persecuted. Mordecai was persecuted by the wicked Haman, and Jesus was persecuted by the rebellious people. Mordecai, by his prayer, delivered his people from the hands of Haman, and Jesus, by his prayer, delivered his people from the hands of Satan. Mordecai was delivered from the hands of his persecutor, and Jesus was rescued from the hands of his persecutors. Because Mordecai sat and clothed himself with sackcloth, he saved Esther and his people from the sword. And because Jesus clothed himself with a body and was illuminated, he saved the church and her children from death.
So do you guys see the parallel there? And like throughout the story, we see how, as the story goes, we see how he symbolizes Christ. Haman plotted against Mordecai and prepared gallows to hang him, as the devil also manipulated the Jews to crucify our Lord. The gallows prepared for Mordecai ended up being the exact same gallows that were used for Haman's destruction, just as our Lord's cross defeated Satan. And also Mordecai won victory and sat at the right hand of the king, as our Lord by the cross won victory over death and sits at the right hands of the Father. So the church fathers continue for another quote I did want to mention, because I do think it highlights a lot of details for this theme as well. Can anybody read this for me, please?
Mordecai received the honor of Haman, his persecutor, and Jesus received great glory from his father, instead of his persecutors, who were of the foolish people. Mordecai trod upon the neck of Haman, his persecutor, and as for Jesus, his enemies shall be put under his feet. Before Mordecai, Haman proclaimed, "Thus shall it be done to the man in honoring whom the king is pleased." And as for Jesus, his preachers came out of the people that persecuted him, and they said, "This is Jesus, the Son of God." The blood of Mordecai was required at the hand of Haman and his sons, and the blood of Jesus, his persecutors, took upon themselves and upon their children. Further degree.
Thank you. So as we mentioned in the beginning, the Old Testament is filled with so many things to us that reveal a lot of things that sometimes we don't notice. Like I personally didn't know this before I prepared this over the last few days. But as we go through the Old Testament, not only do we see, as we talked about, God working behind the scenes, but we also see more about how everything kind of points to the story of salvation. And throughout the book, sorry, the font here is quite small, but throughout the book, there are so many parallels to Christ. So, from the beginning, we see that Mordecai adopts Esther as his own child, the same way that God adopts believers into his family as his own children. In Esther 3, we see that the king promotes, sorry, it's very small. The king promotes Haman the same way that Satan has the power to harm God's people. Not harm them, but he has power to execute harm. Here we see that Mordecai wouldn't bow down to Haman. This also foreshadows when Christ would refuse to bow to Satan while he was being tempted in the wilderness. In Esther 4, we see that when Mordecai finds out about the plan to destroy the Jews, he weeps. The same way we see that Jesus cried and wept at the Garden of Gethsemane. Esther 5, we see that the plan is to hang Mordecai because Haman plotted against him. The same way we see how Christ would be hung on the cross. Chapter 7, we see that Haman hanged on his own gallows that he prepared to destroy Mordecai. The same way that we see that God can take Satan's crafty schemes and use them for good. In chapter 8, we see that the king gives Haman's home to Esther, and the same way that this symbolizes that God will execute Satan and then give Satan's domain to God's children. And then the chapter ends off with Mordecai being crowned, the same way that Jesus is crowned by God. Chapter 9, we see that the Jews defeat their enemies, and the same way this parallels to how God and his people will be victorious over their enemy. And then, of course, chapter 10, we see how Mordecai is honored, and this foreshadows how also Jesus will sit at the right hand of the Father. So I just thought that was interesting to highlight the parallels there from a Christology perspective. Okay, so coming to our third theme is the theme of compassion. So we see here how Esther had compassion both for Mordecai and her people. So even when she was in a position where she was comfortable, she was, no one knew she was Jewish, so you could say that she wasn't at as much risk as the people. She could have stayed silent or maybe felt that this wasn't really something that would directly affect her had she not said anything. But Esther continues to show compassion. Even when she hears that Mordecai is outside weeping bitterly and very distraught from this, we see here in Esther chapter 4, verse 4 and 5, that when she hears about this, she sends clothes for him to put on him instead of his sackcloth, and she summons Hathach, one of the king's eunuchs, assigned to attend to her, and ordered him to find out what was troubling Mordecai and why. And I think the theme of compassion is so important for us to recognize here and to think about, because so many times if we're in a position where we see those around us suffering, or we see that there is something we can do for other people, sometimes we don't initially recognize that. And sometimes from a distance we might say, have compassion on the people from a distance, but sometimes we don't actively act in a way to show our compassion to them. And then scripture commands us to do that, and it says, rejoice with those who rejoice and mourn with those who mourn in Romans 12. So I think it's something for us to reflect on, and I don't think we choose to stay comfortable out of being selfish or self-centered. It's more so sometimes we're just so preoccupied with our own lives that it's difficult for us to recognize where are opportunities for us to show compassion. Sometimes it could be something as simple as someone's going through a hard time, to check on them. That there's something I can do to support someone who maybe doesn't have the support from other people. And really this could sometimes be God working through us for other people, and something that could be a very small gesture from our end can really go a long way for others. So I think the theme of compassion here is something that's very evident in the book. And then of course, if we're talking about Esther, this wouldn't be complete without talking about one of the very famous and memorable verses from the book here, where it shows her courage. So Esther 4, verse 16, she says, after she's heard about the news and she knows that it's her time to step in and do something, she's very courageous, and with all bravery she says, go gather all the Jews who are present in Shushan and fast for me. Neither eat nor drink for 3 days, night or day. My maids and I will fast likewise. And so I will go to the king, which is against the law. And if I die, I die, or if I perish, I perish. So such a bold statement for her to make at this time. Not only was she about to go talk to the king and ask him to reverse a decree or to change a decree that he has publicly, stated, so that's risky in itself. But also at this point, she's about to go to the king and reveal her identity as a Jew. So really, from a human perspective, the situation likely won't end well. Like now he knows the woman he was married to all this time. It's very risky, the position she's putting herself in. But still, with all courage and all bravery, she steps in and she's willing to do the right thing and kind of put her life on the line. And something also very important to note here is that she says she's going to fast and she's going to wait. Two things that arguably are very difficult to do, fasting and waiting. And I think the concept of waiting we see all throughout the Bible, and this could be a whole talk on its own, so for the sake of time, I won't focus too much on that. But something I did want to mention is anytime we look at any story in the Old Testament or even the New Testament, we see that when God's about to do something really great or God's about to reveal himself, it's always followed or it's always after a period of waiting. It doesn't usually happen, instantaneously. Even the resurrection was after a period of waiting. If you look at any story, Abraham, Joseph, David, any of the stories, there's always a period of waiting. And I think no one here is probably a stranger to a season of waiting. I think it's something everyone goes through at some point. And during the time, it's so hard to see how the situation will end. It's so hard to see, is God actively doing anything? Like from Esther's perspective and Mordecai's perspective, the situation is going from bad to worse, and really it doesn't look like things are looking good for these people. But with all courage, Esther knows and has the confidence that with fasting and with waiting, God will reveal to her her next step. And it's only after this period of waiting and fasting that she comes out and she's very confident in what she's going to do. Like if Esther had thought of the situation in any other way, if she maybe would have approached the king on the first day of the banquet, remember how we said they had the first day of the banquet, she didn't tell him yet, and she waited for the second day. What happened in between the first and the second day? That's when the king couldn't sleep. That's when the king read the chronicles, the royal chronicles, and realized, oh, Mordecai's actually really great and I want to honor him. That's when he realized that this guy that he really wants to honor, the next day he finds out that Haman is trying to kill him. So had Esther not really surrendered her plan and her next step to God, she might have acted maybe impulsively. Maybe she would have said, okay, I'll just talk to the king right away, or I'll act right now. But for her to know the right thing to do and for her to be able to see her role in God's plan, it was really, important that she takes that time of fasting and waiting for God to reveal that to her. And because of that, she's able to act so clearly and know her next step, and that plan eventually leads to the salvation of the Jews. So kind of wrapping up here, we did start off by saying that this book is often referred to as the story of the invisible hand of God because it's the only book in the Bible where the word God is not mentioned at all. And now looking at the story, looking at how the whole story unfolded, if I would have asked you in chapter 3 or in chapter 4 is when all this stuff happens, where is God in the story? Which we might have not been able to see at that. We might have not been able to see how God is acting, how this is going to end. If we were in the story, we might have even said like, okay, yeah, it's over for us. Like this is not looking good, and maybe God has left us. Maybe God has forgotten us. But when we look at the story, at the end of the story, at chapter 10, we're able to see that God's silence did not mean his absence. God not doing things right now and right away, and speaking to no vision came to them right away and said, don't worry, you're going to come out okay. It was really them holding on to that trust, them living that life of obedience, or Mordecai, always trying to do the right thing in the sight of God. Esther taking that time to wait on God and to fast and to surrender her plans to God, that we're really able to see God's plan prevail and how he's able to work in their lives. And to wrap up, I just want to show the contrast between how things looked from the human perspective at the time and how things actually were from God's perspective. So from the human perspective, Queen Vashti was the queen, and there was no plan for her to not be the queen. Like if I would have asked you at the time, who's going to be the queen in 5 months from now, everyone would have said Queen Vashti. So from the human perspective, Queen Vashti is going to remain the queen, and Esther is going to remain the orphan girl. But in God's perspective, no, Queen Vashti is dethroned, and Esther is the queen. From the human perspective, the king, Mordecai saves the king, and he's not acknowledged. His good works are not acknowledged. But from God's perspective, Mordecai saves the king and is later remembered and rewarded, and this is used as part of the story. From the human perspective, Haman is honored, so the bad guy is winning here from the human perspective. Therefore, he's going to have authority, and he's going to execute his authority, and he's going to do whatever he wants. But from God's perspective and God's plan, Mordecai is honored, therefore he gains favor in the eyes of the king. From the human perspective, Haman kills Mordecai on the 2 gallows, so not looking good for Mordecai. However, from God's perspective, Haman is powerless, or I think I missed a point there, but from God's perspective, Mordecai will be the one to die on the 2 gallows. From the human perspective, I don't know if I already said this one, but Haman is powerful and will conquer God's people. But from God's perspective, Haman is powerless and God's people will prevail. And then, of course, we see here that from the human perspective, it did not look good for the Jews, and the Jews will be killed because the decree could not be reversed, especially in the Persian Empire during that time. Once a decree came out, that's it. It was whatever was in the decree was going to be what was carried out. But from God's perspective, the Jews will be saved, and the decree can be overridden. And I want to end off with something that King David said, and I think he sums it up so nicely. And he says here in the Psalm, "He will not let your foot slip. He who watches over you will not slumber. Indeed, he who watches over Israel will neither slumber nor sleep." And when you read this verse, you can replace the word Israel with you. So God, who's constantly watching over you, he will not slumber, and he who watches over you will neither slumber nor sleep. So even when it feels like, maybe God's not actively doing anything in my life, and it feels like maybe God's forgotten me, or, I can't really see him working in my life right now, remember how in the story of Esther, all throughout, it seemed that exact same way. It seemed that God is not doing anything. But looking back from the perspective at the end, we see how God was working all throughout, and his fingerprints are undeniably shown throughout the story. And that's all I've got.
One thing actually that caught my attention, that we say that a king's decree cannot be easily cancelled, which is reminding me of the decree that Jesus tore on the cross. So we think that God's decree about death, why didn't God forgive? Why didn't God just go back? Because sometimes we wonder. So if earthly kings have difficulty canceling their decree, how about a divine and godly decree to be cancelled? It requires a lot of work, which is what happened. Like here, the decree, it took a while and it took a lot of work to reverse the decree, which is exactly the work of our Lord Jesus Christ on the cross to cancel the decree of our sin and our death on the wood of the cross as well. So like the decree and the king cannot go back kind of struck me to hear it and link it to the parallel. Yes.
Well, thank you for sharing that. Any other comments? I'm not going to say questions, I'd rather hear your comments. Yes.
Like what I really liked is just seeing that you would immediately think like Mordecai having saved the king, like you feel like there's so much like injustice and like, wow, like he didn't even get rewarded for that. And it's like the whole like concept of like, yeah, but it was for a plan because he got mentioned and honored at a time where he needed it the most, where it's not just about like getting honored, but it's that, like it's not about the right now, it was when he needed it, and like the whole timeline of his life was like, we can't see it from an earthly perspective, like we don't know like when that time is going to come when we need that.
Wow, thank you. I love that. It's so true. Like Mordecai could have easily said, I'm doing the right thing. It's not going acknowledged. What's the point? Or why didn't my reward come? But as Nancy mentioned, like it comes at the perfect time, which goes back to the whole concept of waiting and God's timing being perfect.
I just want to comment that, that comment you said that Queen Vashti was always going to be the queen. So then when Queen Esther became the queen, is that it's not all of a sudden she became the queen and then saved her people. It was that the Lord had planned far before her becoming a queen for her to save her people. So there's a lot of preparation work that came from God 100%. to put into Esther courage, bravery, and like maintaining integrity to her people, that when she was a queen, she would be able to take that. So I feel like there's a lot of like pre-work that went into the work that, like the work of God. So 100%. You don't become a queen overnight. You become a queen as a work in progress, and once you are a queen, you're able to execute God's plan because that's your role right there from that.
Yeah.
So I feel like when you look at her life, yes, she was an orphan girl, but the Lord takes nothing and creates wonders out of it. So where you come from is not necessarily where you're going. Where you come from is where the Lord chooses for you to be.
Yeah.
So I think that's a really good, like, practical point to take away in our lives. That
100%, yeah.
yeah.
No, I love that reflection. And I think we also see that with King David. You know, we see that it's not right away, you know, a shepherd boy is chosen to be king, and it's not instantaneously where he leaves his sheep and runs to the palace. We see, you know, as you mentioned, you put it so beautifully, that God kind of primes them for what he needs from them and how he needs them to work on behalf of his people and at the perfect time.
Exactly.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. Any other thoughts, comments, or questions? No? Okay.
Thank you, Marina. Thank you. Thank you very much. And maybe I also want to kind of emphasize the theme, God invisible hand, or no mention of God doesn't mean that God does not exist, or God's silence does not mean